27, present adverbial participles. So remember the participle is defined as a verbal adjective, so it's going to have both verbal elements and adjectival elements. We're going to start by looking at the adverbial participle and then move from there to the adjectival. Okay, here are our key terms. Before we get started, we need a maxim. Always notes taking, always A's making. Okay? You're not just watching these videos, you are taking notes. You are trying to distill this information, you're interacting with it in your mind and getting it down on paper, and this is the first stage in your understanding of the material. So here it is. How to form the participle. Well, participles, because they are verbal adjectives, they are going to have both tense and voice. Now, we do not have, for the participle, all of the tenses that we have for the indicative. For the indicative, we had 6 different tenses. Good news, the participle will have only the present, the aorist, and the perfect. There is such a thing as a future participle, but it's quite rare. For voice, and this is the relationship between the subject and the verb, we have 3 options again: the active, the middle, and the passive. So there's our verbal side. But because the participle is a verbal adjective, it has an adjectival / nominal side. So it will have case and number. And the good news here is that it uses the familiar endings third declension and first declension in what we call a 3-1-3 pattern as we go across masculine, feminine, neuter, or a 2-1-2 pattern in the masculine, feminine, and neuter using second declension, first declension, second declension, neuter. Okay, with that background, we come then to our equation. How do we form the participle? We have a stem, we have a connecting vowel, and then we have something called a participial morpheme. And it's this little indicator that tells you that it's a participle. And then you'll finish off with the case ending. So our participial morphemes, Nutah and USA, will be used with a 3-1-3 declension pattern. Mena will be used with a 2-1-2 declension pattern, and Omicron Ta will be used with a 3-1-3 pattern. Now, there's an easy way to remember this, actually, and it's quite cute. Our participial morphemes: Old Testament, New Testament, and what comes between the Old and the New Testament? The intertestamento period. Whatever works. Okay, so when we form the participle, we're going to start with the present active. We're just putting building blocks together: a stem, connecting vowel, participial morpheme, and case endings. 4 things. Okay, so the Nutah with the USA, the 3-1-3, this is what we use when we're forming the present active participle. Of our different participial morphemes, the present active will use either Nutah or USA, and I'll show you how you know which. So as we go across masculine, feminine, and neuter, we're using Nutah in the masculine, USA in the feminine, and Nutah in the neuter. And this is going to correspond with a third declension masculine, first declension feminine, and a third declension neuter. So look below the morphemes and you've got your declension endings and your familiar third declension masculine, which is usually sasia esoncias. Sasia esoncias. Now with the participle and some nouns, it's possible to use no ending here at all. And this is what we're going to do with the present active participle. We'll actually end up using no ending. The feminine, we're using the first declension. It's your first declension endings, but it's that peculiar ace kind of first declension that mixes the alpha stem and the eta stem. And then the neuter, we use the third declension neuter endings, blank, asi, blank, sia. So that you already know. And here's what it looks like. So some places to look out for. The nominative. We've got in red the nominative masculine singular and the nominative neuter singular. Now, we have here some rules that come into play that you've seen before. If we don't use an ending in the nominative, as we said, the nominative masculine sometimes doesn't use an ending. When you add your participial morpheme nu ta, the ta drops off at the end of a word. This is a very common rule in Greek. The ta drops off at the end of the word, just like that. So when that happens, now the word begins to feel inadequate because it lost a part of itself. It feels small. So it goes to the gem, and this omicron starts to work out because it wants to feel masculine. And eventually it develops a pair of pectoral muscles that looks like an omega. So it ends up looking like luon in the nominative. Now, what happens in the neuter? The same thing. You lose your ta at the end of the word because no ending is used. But now, why doesn't the omicron go to the gem? Well, it doesn't need to feel masculine, does it? Because it's not. It's neuter. So it just remains luon with an omicron there. The other place to look out for is in the dative plural. In the masculine and neuter, what's happened here? You remember the rule? A nu ta before sigma will drop out. So just think of the sigma as steamrolling the ta and then steamrolling the nu, and then you end up with a word that's again feeling very inadequate because it's lost a part of itself, and it goes to the gem again, and the omicron tries to turn into a pair of pectoral muscles, but it's just a little bit lopsided and it doesn't quite look symmetrical. But that happens also in the neuter. Formation of the present middle passive participle. Stem, connecting vowel, morpheme, case endings. What's going to be different is the participial morpheme and a different case ending pattern. So now instead of using the nu ta and usa, we're going to use the mina, mine, participial morpheme, and second declension masculine, first declension feminine, second declension neuter endings, and what we call the 2-1-2 pattern. So here's what it looks like. We've got mina, mine, minon, in a 2-1-2 pattern. So the second declension masculine endings, you remember as, u, o, on, oi, on, ois, us. The first declension feminine endings, you remember a, ace, a, ain, I, on, ice, as. And the second declension neuter endings, you remember on, u, o, on, a, on, ois, a. And by the way, it's a good thing to continue to run through these old endings. Just because you learned it before and you've been quizzed on it before doesn't mean you'll remember it permanently unless you continue to recite and write these endings. And here's what it looks like when it's all put together. So just to go back to our chop it policy, there's your stem, there's your connecting vowel, and then your participial morpheme followed by your 2-1-2 endings. All right, now the formation of a me is actually quite simple. If you remember, a me is the word I am, the so-called copulative verb. Looking at the endings, I haven't written them out entirely. And the reason for that is because they should already look familiar based on what we've just done. The participle of a me in the present looks exactly like the participial endings for the present active that we just went over, except the endings only without anything preceding. So haven't written out the rest because that's provided for you already on those other slides. So you should be feeling pretty good about formation of the present participles. The most difficult part about participles by far is translation of participles. So when we translate adverbial participles, we have a number of different options. You will be able to identify a participle as adverbial by the fact that it will be anarthrous. Now, just because it's anarthrous doesn't mean it's necessarily an adverbial participle, but an adverbial participle will always be anarthrous. In other words, it will lack the article. Next, we don't have 6 tenses for the participle like we had for the indicative. We don't have all those options. And in fact, time itself is less significant with the participle. Remember that with indicative verbs, you have both time and aspect encoded in the grammar or in the endings. With the participle, it's primarily aspect that's encoded. Time is present, but it's a different kind of time. It's not absolute time, it's relative time. So what's it relative to? The time of the participle will be relative to the time of the main verb in the sentence. So here's an example. Pandindran me poyun karpan kalan ekaptai. So I've underlined both the main verb in black and the participle in red. If you look at the main verb in black, it's indicative. It's a present middle passive indicative. So because it's present, when will the participle be happening in time? The present participle will be happening at the same time as the main verb. So if the present is the tense of the main verb, then the participle in the present will be happening at the same time, which will be in the present. Now that might all sound very obvious, but what if you had an aorist indicative main verb? Now the main action is happening in the past. When is the time of the present participle? It's happening at the same time as the past action, so the present participle would then be happening in the past. You see how that works? So the time is relative to the time of the main verb. So here it says, every tree not bearing good fruit is cut off. So both being in the present. And here, peripaton de para tain thalasan eden dua adelphus. So we have now, Aiden is actually in the aorist tense. So peripaton, our present participle, will be happening when? At the same time as that past aorist action. So, and walking beside the sea, he saw two brothers. So the walking is now actually happening in the past. Now, how this will bear on your translation, because it appears not to make a difference, how this bears on your translation will be made evident in just a second. When we get to the aorist, we'll see an aorist participle will be happening before the action of the main verb. And a perfect participle before the main verb, but with present consequences. Okay, so with the present participle, we typically use an ing rendering. So in the previous example, for example, walking, just simple ing rendering for the present participle. But we also have other options. We can actually expand the translation of the participle in English. Often you can translate the participle temporally, adding the word while before it, so while walking. Or you can translate it causally, adding since. So now in the previous example, passing by he saw Levi the son of Alphaeus. Easy enough. But if we want to, we can ask, what's the relationship between the passing by and the seeing? What's the relationship between the passing by and the seeing? You might argue, well, it's basically a temporal relationship. And if it's temporal, you could say, while passing by, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus. So this is a more expansive way of translating the participle. How you would know to translate it temporally, you would just have to ask about the logic of the sentence and the relationship between the two actions. So in this example, ha'anthropos apethene didaskon tein koinein. Now we have the man died teaching the koine. So if we use our simple ing rendering, that's what we get. But we could ask, what's the relationship between the dying and the teaching? We might argue it's a temporal relationship. So the man died while teaching koine. Now this example is a little different. Joseph, being righteous, wanted secretly to divorce her. If we go kind of word for word. So being righteous. This time if we ask what the relationship between the being and the deciding is, you got to ask, why did he decide this? He decided this because he was righteous. So the relationship between the participle and the main verb is a relationship of cause and effect. And on that basis, we could expand it to say Joseph, because he was righteous, decided to divorce her quietly. So what we see with these examples is that the information, the conjunctions we're using, while and since, There's no word for them actually used in these Greek sentences. We're getting that information from what is or seems to be implied in the thought of the sentence. We can go even further. If ing is our simplest rendering of the participle, and an adverbial participle could be expanded to reflect a temporal or a causal relationship with the main verb, we have to remember that the participle also has a gender and number that we determine from the case endings. And that gender and number will tell you who is actually performing the action of the participle. So here, paragon, if you look at the case ending, that's the ending for the nominative masculine singular. Now, if it's masculine singular, we can supply the pronoun he, and now we've expanded the participle into a subordinate clause, while he was passing by. While he was passing by. So that's a very expansive translation, but it's a legitimate translation. So there are actually other ways to translate adverbial participles as well. And we've just looked at two ways. If it's temporal, we add while. If it's causal, we add since or because. But adverbial participles can be translated in other ways as well. And with each of these, we just have to ask what's going to be the key word, usually a key conjunction to precede the participle. While, since. If it's a participle of manner, you will use no conjunction at all. But a participle can also indicate means, the means by which the main action occurs. So by walking. Or if it's conditional, you'll introduce the participle with if walking, concessive, although walking, purpose, in order to walk, or in order that he might walk, depending on the gender of the ending, result, so that he might walk, so that she might walk. And again, this is the hardest part of participles, is understanding how to expand them in ways that accurately reflect what the participle can do and accurately reflects the tense, voice, and the case ending, especially the gender and number of it. So you'll need to, as you come to a Greek sentence, identify the main verb and then look at the participle and ask, what's the relationship between the main verb and the participle? In other words, in what way is the participle modifying the main verb? Since they are, after all, adverbial. Temporal, as cause, as means, and so on. Let's go over our vocab. Anabino, archierus, dexios, dua, heteros, euangelizo, theoreo, Jerusalema, kathemai, katabino, hu, perikaleo, patho, and trace. Okay, still creeping up. Now remember, you're always making flashcards for these. And I recommend as you go through, you're not just learning the words by sight, you're also learning them by sound. And to get both the sight and the sound, it's going to help reinforce that material and pressing it onto your brain. Anabino, 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 to go up. Archierus, 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 high priest, and so on. All right, keep up the good work. It's going to take practice, it's going to take lots of repetition, but you're going to get there.